Welcome to our podcast. We're diving deep into a radical reinterpretation of early Christian history. Imagine this. What if the Apostle Paul, as we've known him for 2,000 years, never existed at all?
Wow, that's quite a twist. So we're saying the iconic letters attributed to Paul might actually be, a literary invention?
Exactly. It's a theory suggesting that the man behind the mask of Paul was actually Marcion of Sinope, a wealthy Roman shipping magnate who arrived in Rome around 140 CE with a message and his own canon.
Yup, and that canon was like a two-part scripture, an edited version of the Gospel of Luke and a set of 10 so-called Pauline letters. Isn't it wild to think that these texts were carefully curated for a very specific strategy?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
The strategy here was, not just to teach a theology, but to build a whole alternative Christian version that appealed to a post-war audience scarred by the destruction wrought by the Roman-Jewish wars.
Right. So, with a backdrop of the First Jewish-Roman War and the Bar Kokhba revolt creating chaos and disillusionment, Marcion stepped in with a kind of bridge religion. That must have been a really calculated move, don't you think?
Exactly. It's like he was offering a faith that used familiar Jewish symbols but completely rejected Jewish law, an almost, a gospel of grace over works for a new world order.
Yeah. And that means the so-called Apostle Paul was crafted as this ideal apostle to lead this new, Gentile-centric faith. But if Paul was just an invention of Marcion's school, where are his historical roots?
That's the kicker. Paul, as we know him, has no independent evidence outside Marcion's writings, no mentions in Jewish records, no nods from Roman historians, Josephus, Tacitus, or Pliny. It's as if he only exists within these texts that were later absorbed into what became Orthodox Christianity.
Right, which really makes you, question. If he were a real historical figure, wouldn't there be more records or personal testimonies from eyewitnesses?
Exactly. And the conversion story of Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, where Saul, a former enemy, morphs into this spiritual champion through a dramatic, almost theatrical conversion, is, well, it almost reads like literature with its sudden, symbolic transformation.
Yeah, it's definitely more like a literary allegory, something that emphasizes the themes of grace and divine intervention rather than being a factual, historical account.
And here's what's even more fascinating. Scholars like Markus Vinzent, Robert M. Price, Jason BeDuhn, and Joseph Tyson argue that these letters were entirely crafted in a theological think tank, Marcion's school, rather than by an historical apostle.
Now, hold on a minute. I understand the arguments, but isn't it a bit of a stretch to completely dismiss Paul as a historical figure? I mean, there are layers to these texts beyond just theory, right?
That's a fair point. Some argue that the literary construction doesn't necessarily negate a historical kernel. A man might have existed, but his role was, perhaps, magnified or even rewritten to serve a specific agenda. But proponents of the theory contend the gaps in the historical record are too glaring to ignore.
Interesting. So, in this view, Marcion wasn't just a theologian. He was a sort of meta-narrative architect who built the framework of what would eventually be the New Testament.
Exactly. It's like he designed a set of texts that had all the right elements to unify a fragmented post-war society. And then later, as the Proto-Catholic Church rose to power, they absorbed his work and even rebranded it as Orthodox, while demonizing Marcion himself.
Yup, the irony being that the very church that excommunicated Marcion later used his crafted texts to solidify its own beliefs. Talk about, recycling ideas.
Absolutely. It's like a literary performance, a staged narrative meant to give order to a chaotic empire. What if the celebrated conversion, his epic bold claims, and his mystic visions were all, artfully composed to bridge theological divides?
It's crazy to think about, especially since, as you mentioned, Marcion's canon specifically omitted other key figures like Peter, James, and Hebrews, focusing instead on this idealized version of Paul. That suggests a very targeted design.
Right. And it was a deliberate choice. by excluding those earlier traditions and emphasizing Paul, or rather, the version of him that served Marcion's purpose. They were reshaping what Christianity was meant to convey.
Yeah, and think about the timing too. After those devastating wars, a lot of people were probably looking for a fresh start, something that could offer peace, absolution, and a break from the past. Marcion's message, with its focus on grace and a loving, unjudgmental deity, really matched that need.
Exactly. It tapped into a social and political necessity for healing. The narrative of a transcendent, non-Jewish divine messenger made it perfectly suited for those eager to leave behind a tumultuous history.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. But here's something that still bugs me. If Marcion synthesized these texts so specifically for his own vision, doesn't that undermine the credibility of the entire New Testament canon? Like, how do we separate genuine inspiration from, calculated editing?
Well, that's the debate, isn't it? The theory challenges the notion of divine revelation by suggesting that what we consider sacred scripture was, to a great extent, a product of human strategic storytelling. It's a radical idea that forces us to rethink authenticity in early Christianity.
Yep. And it's also a reminder of how history can be reinterpreted and repackaged based on prevailing needs and power struggles. It really puts the focus on how much editorial dogma one might have unwittingly accepted.
Indeed, the absence of external references to Paul in contemporary records really does add weight to the possibility that his persona was more myth than man.
Yeah. But don't you think some might argue that the lack of external validation could also be due to the chaotic nature of that era? I mean, record-keeping and surviving texts were pretty spotty back then.
That's a solid counterpoint. While the scarcity of evidence plays into the theory of a literary invention, it could also simply reflect the turbulent times. However, the sheer volume of inconsistencies in the letters, like duplicate endings and interpolations, adds fuel to the fire for skeptics of the historical Paul.
Yep, those textual anomalies definitely seem hard to explain as mere transcription errors. It almost reinforces that intentional, crafted nature of these writings.
Absolutely. When you consider that these letters now form a core part of Christian doctrine, it shifts the entire discussion to what constitutes authority in religious writings.
And it's fascinating to think that this reinterpretation not only challenges our understanding of Paul, but also the power dynamics that shaped the Christian canon. It's like uncovering the hidden layers of an ancient political theater.
Perfectly put. It's as if Marcion was both a theologian and a master strategist, using his manuscript to influence, even control, the narrative of a faith that was desperately in need of reinvention.
And then, later, when the church absorbed his work, they conveniently eliminated his name from history while still reaping the benefits of his creation. Quite the dramatic irony, huh?
Definitely, it's like a historical plot twist straight out of a thriller novel. It makes you wonder how many other canonical figures might have been, subject to such creative reinterpretation.
Yeah, it's a potent reminder that history isn't always a straightforward account of events, but sometimes a carefully constructed narrative that serves the interests of those in power.
Exactly. And it challenges us to, look beyond traditional interpretations and question even the most established texts, wondering, what if what we've believed for centuries was, well, more art than history?
And that's the beauty of historical inquiry. Each new perspective, even a challenging one like this, pushes our understanding further. It's a dynamic process, always open to reevaluation and reinterpretation.
Right on. Whether you buy into the theory or remain a skeptic, it's a fascinating examination of how beliefs are shaped, preserved, and sometimes manipulated through time.
Absolutely. It definitely invites us to keep questioning and exploring the origins of our traditions. Thanks for walking through this intricate puzzle with me today.
Thank you. And remember, to truly understand our past, we must be willing to peel away every layer, even if it reveals some uncomfortable truths.